Hey everyone, welcome back to Happy Hour. Kind of got a little special edition this week. The past couple weeks we've been talking about cocktails, how to make them, how they work, how to build them, the recipes. But for those of you who may not want to be juicing fresh limes and getting your hands sticky making simple syrup, I thought today we'd talk about actually one of my favorite spirits, Scotch. So it's kind of a confusing category. It may be a little intimidating when you go to the store to find out what you should get, what you shouldn't get, how to read the label, what does it mean, what does it not mean. So just gonna go over a quick little sort of 101 on Scotch on what it means and what is it actually in the bottle when it says single malt or blended malt and so on. So if you think about shoes, right? You have the category of shoes, and then below that, the subcategories are sandals, boots, stilettos, and so on. If you take shoes out and you add whiskey, Scotch is a type of whiskey, bourbon is a type of whiskey, Japanese whiskey, Irish whiskey are all types of whiskey. So whiskey is a distillate that comes from a cereal grain. So by cereal grain, I mean wheat, corn, barley, rye, oat, spelt. Those are cereal grains. So in the term of Scotch, most of the time it is used the grain of barley. So when you think about the production of Scotch, we take barley, but barley does not have fermentable sugars. In order for us to make a spirit, we have to start with a liquid that has some form of an alcohol content. So you think of making brandy, you use wine. When we make whiskey, we essentially start with beer. So we take the barley, but barley sugars are not fermentable. So we have to make the sugars inside the grain from non-fermentable to fermentable. The way we do that is we trick it. So we take the barley, we soak it in warm water, and we lay it out in a warm, humid environment to trick the grain to think we've actually planted it. Once it thinks that it's been planted, it goes through the process called germination. That process changes the sugars from non-fermentable to fermentable. Now that we've got the sugars going, we have to stop it, because if we keep the process going, we're actually going to plant the barley crop. And then the sugars are going to be all used, and we don't have anything to then go through the process of fermentation. So we got to stop that. There's two ways to do that typically. One, we put it on a malting floor, which is a perforated floor. We blow hot up air through it. That hot air dries out the grain, and now we've got malted barley. In the process of making some other styles of Scotch, like the one I have in front of me, is we use peat to fuel a fire, and that smoke from that fire dries out the grain. And peat is P-E-A-T. It's compressed earth. It's not this guy Pete that we put in this. That would be cruel. But we dry the grain out and it stops germination. Now we've got the sugars fermentable. We take that barley, we then mix it with water, we extract the sugars into the liquid, we go through the fermentation by adding yeast. We've now created alcohol, and we can go through the process of distillation. When we distill it, we now have an unaged spirit. In Scotch, the unaged spirit we call new make. So after we've got that new make, we then age it, and now we can have Scotch. So on a label, you'll typically see it'll say single malt Scotch. Single, it came from one distillery. Malt, it's 100% malted barley. That's the grain we used. Scotch, it's distilled, matured, and bottled on Scottish soil. Whiskey, it's matured in oak casks for no less than 3 years. It's bottled at no less than 40% alcohol by volume, and you only use barley, water, and yeast to make it. So single malt Scotch. One distillery, all barley, made in Scotland, aged 3 years. Then you have what's called blended Scotch. So blended means it comes from more than one distillery. Scotch, it's made in Scotland. And then whiskey, it's aged 3 years and bottled at no less than 40% alcohol by volume. The thing about blended Scotch is you can take two different single malts and you mix it with what we call a grain whiskey. A grain whiskey is whiskey that's made with other grains than just barley. So it could be corn, it could be wheat. So you take that whiskey, that distillate, you age it 3 years, and then you mix it or blend it with the single malts from the distilleries. So your Dewar's, your Famous Grouse, your Chivas Brothers, your Johnny Walkers, these are blended scotches. I take that back. Johnnie Walker, with the exception of Johnnie Walker Green. All the other Johnnie Walker lines are blended scotches. Johnnie Walker Green is a blended malt Scotch whiskey. So notice the word malt comes back in. When we talked about single malt, malt meant that it has 100% malted barley. So a blended malt Scotch whiskey is a whiskey that is a blend of just single malts. So if I take the Bellagio single malt, the New York single malt, the MGM Grand single malt, and mix them together and bottle it, I would have a blended malt Scotch whiskey because it has all single malts in it. With all this talking, I'm getting thirsty, which you can tell I clearly don't like this with how much is left. So glassware, rocks glass, sort of a whiskey glass, bell-shaped, and then this is called a Glencairn glass, which you typically see when we talk about drinking Scotch. I actually prefer the bell glass or the rocks glass. I have a big nose, so it's hard to drink out of this. So just to give it a quick little taste, this is Lagavulin 16 year. So this is an Islay Scotch. So it has a smoke characteristic to it. We measure smoke by parts per million. So this has about 26, 28 parts per million. So good. But you have to like Islay Scotch. When we stop the process of germination, we use the smoke from the peat. So if you don't like that smoky flavor and that smoky characteristic, you are not gonna like Islay whiskeys. They tend to have this smoky kind of Band-Aid, iodine, salinity to them, which a lot of times you either really, really like or you really, really don't like. But I find them to be beautiful and delicious. And this one is sort of on the milder side. It's not as big and robust as say, your Ardbegs or your Lafroigs are. It's a much more milder entry-level peated whiskey. Whereas what I mentioned earlier, Bruichladdich and Bunnahabhain, while they are both on Islay, they make non-peated whiskeys. So just because it says it comes from Islay and you don't like peat, that doesn't mean you'll never drink an Islay whiskey ever again. There are some that are not, and there's some that are very heavy. So it's all based on your preference and what you like to drink in this beautiful world of Scotch whiskey. So with that, the cheers, everybody. So excited. Next Thursday, June 4th, welcoming back the Las Vegas Strip, Bellagio, New York, MGM Grand. We can't wait to share a Scotch with you at Prime Steakhouse, at Craft Steak. We look forward to it. We've missed you. Safe Vegas is still Vegas. Cheers.